The views expressed in this interview are those of the individuals and do not reflect the official policy or position of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, the U.S. Navy, or the Naval Postgraduate School. Welcome to the Trident Room, brewer of stout conversation, unfiltered and on tap. On today's episode, the Trident Room host, James Reilly, sits down with Lieutenant Ryan Newmeyer.
CO did some amazing stuff. Out of that,
then I go to Italy.
And so in Italy, what is your position there?
So, for the longest time, the Coast Guard, up until I think it was a little bit before sequestration, but we would send a cutter from Atlantic area over to Europe and Africa every summer. Africa Partnership Station. It was like kind of the cool thing. Like you wanted to be on the Africa Partnership Station cutter because you got to do something other than drugs, migrants, or fish, which is the mainstay of what we do, especially in the early 2000s up until the rollout of the Western Hemisphere strategy. But so if you were able to break that cycle and go over to Africa Partnership Station, you were like, that was the cutter you would want to get on. And so as a result, the Coast Guard identified that we needed to have 2 officers in Italy, which is where the U.S. Navy's 6th Fleet is. And the Navy's 6th Fleet is responsible for maritime operations, supporting the European commander and the Africa commander in EUCOM and AFRICOM. And so there are 2 positions there. There's the O5 that is the direct liaison with 6th Fleet, and then there's the lieutenant position, which is also a coveted position, which is what I had. When I was there, it was in Naples. It's now moved to Rota. But my job was to work directly with the tactical commander
Of 6th Fleet.
Of the task force that the cutter would then integrate into, the surface coordinator,
Okay.
CTF 65, Destroyer Squadron 60. So that was where I was. And so like the job kind of morphed over time. So now you're just kind of advising both the 6th Fleet commander and the task force commander, the 06, on kind of Coast Guard operations and how we do things.
Capabilities, like,
because we didn't send cutters over, but we would still send teams to do various to work certain exercises, because there's exercises around the African continent. 3 big ones: the Express series, Phoenix Express in the north, Cutlass Express in the east, and then Obangami Express in the west part of Africa. And so we send Coast Guard law enforcement detachments there to kind of advise and assist like the execution of the exercises and stuff like that. And then for a long time we did Operation Junction Rain, which was a real life kind of operation where we would send, once again, our law enforcement detachments to go either embark on U.S. ships or at sometimes even our African partners on their ships to do advise and assist boardings on, generally speaking, fishing vessels to help them exert maritime sovereignty over their near coastals. And so I was responsible advising the Commodore on that and facilitating the teams entering and exiting the continent and kind of the whole planning cycle with that, which was an awesome experience. Kind of once again, I fit right in because I had already done my previous tour with the Navy, so I understood. I mean, I could speak the language. I didn't have to go to a language school to learn a whole new language of how like the Navy speaks and all of their acronyms. I already knew it.
got it. Got it.
And so like I spent 2 years in Italy, traveling Europe and Africa for both work and fun. I got to see a lot of really cool parts of Africa that I never would have seen otherwise. I planned for the first cutter to come back over, and at that point it was 5 or 6 years. which was also another cool experience to shepherd that project through. And we've now since sent a couple other cutters over, so following a similar path. So that's pretty cool. But it was an eye-opening experience traveling all over Africa for sure, and seeing how different and how vast the continent is.
Came out of that.
Mm-hmm.
Where after that?
Then I had to do my time in Washington. So I got called to headquarters, and there I worked in the Global Motor Coordination Center, which is my favorite because it's an acronym within an acronym. So Global Motor Coordination Center is the Global Maritime Operational Threat Response Coordination Center. And it's this plan, the motor plan, which grew out of one of the Coast Guard's most infamous failures. From 1970, the Seamus Kaderka case, which led to the firing and ending of several Coast Guard officers' careers when a Lithuanian, who at the time we did not know had legitimate claims to U.S. nationality, attempted to defect on board a Coast Guard cutter while anchored off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. And
I do not know about this case.
Really?
No.
So the Kaderka case, it's you learned about it in I think MLE, but you just didn't. Yeah, there's so much stuff going on at the academy that you're just like, wait, not relevant to my major. Data dump, like.
Yeah, my brain's a sieve. It's gone. You'll have to give me like a quick summary of this case, and we can go from there.
So in 1970, height of the Cold War, the Soviet fishing fleet, and this is also predates the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So we were having a meeting between the Coast Guard and the Soviets regarding fishing in the North Atlantic. And the weather was really bad offshore, so the agreement was made to move inshore inside U.S. territorial waters, and they just anchored off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. There was a Lithuanian seaman on board named Seaman Seamus Kaderkas. And he threw a note over to the ship saying that he wanted to defect to the United States, and eventually jumped on board the Coast Guard cutter. And so now we have a problem. And we have somebody, a Soviet, trying to defect on board a U.S. flagship inside U.S. waters, and we don't know how to do it. And, of course, this is, Friday afternoon, and the admiral at the time in charge of, at that point, I think it was District 2, but he was out on some medical thing. So it was his chief of staff who was taking the call, trying to call down to Washington to get people online to figure out what are we going to do. Because the captain of a ship does not have the authority, and nor should he, have the authority to grant asylum or any sort of handling that defection. It is now definitely CO 101. Like, you don't have the authority to do that. You pick up the phone and you call somebody else because you give them safe refuge, but you don't make those decisions. And so the district calls down to headquarters and says, well, what are we going to do about this? And there was no interagency process to get unified agreement within the Beltway. And so they tried to call a couple of people at the State Department. Nobody was answering the phone. Then eventually they got somebody, and they said, no, we don't want to. We can't deal with this. And so the word comes down from Washington to send him back. And the captain, Ralph Eustace, was like, I don't really want to do it, but he was told to send them back. So, sure enough, because the KGB on board these ships wanted him back, they definitely didn't want anybody defecting. They said, all right, the cutter said, all right, you guys can come on board and get him and bring him back. So, of course, there's this ensuing problem where they're running around the ship. Eventually, they catch him on board the 210, which is not a big ship. There's not a lot of places to hide. Beat him on board the cutter, and then drag him back to the Lithuanian fishing boat.
I remember this now. Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember the whole chasing the guy
Yes.
around the cutter and then, physically, like, basically beating him up
Not
on
great.
board a U.S. flag vessel and then, dragging him
Yes.
to the, yes.
Of course, this gets onto the front page of the New York Times. Because then it comes out that on his mother's side, he has a claim, I believe it's to birthright citizenship, because there was a tie that he could claim American citizenship.
So now it's like they beat up American citizen, more or
Yes.
less.
More or less, yeah.
Yeah.
So it gets equally bad. And it, like all regulations, are paved, unfortunately, with blood at some point. This radically changed how the U.S. government makes decisions inside the Beltway. So after that, a couple years later, they issue what's called Presidential Directive 27, the PD 27 process, which talks about how the U.S. government responds to incidences not relating to the military. And this was all sorts of incidents, not just maritime incidents, but just all sorts of incidents. And it, required departments to maintain a 24/7 watch center. I mean, it was radical in the, I think it was, I can't remember what year it was, but it was in like the mid-70s when this came out. Radically changed how it happened and like required phone calls and all this other stuff to get interagency coordination, because at the time, there was no, like I said, there was no process to deal with these instances that didn't have a military nexus. And so, you had a call, and everybody, all of the major stakeholders from the various departments got on a call and said, all right, yes, this is the official position of the government. We are going to do this. There are going to be no surprises at this point. All of the various departments have had their issues aired to solve the problem.
So the office you were working in, it was you were working in the Coast Guard arm of this joint office, or
No.
No.
So over time, it evolved. In post 9/11, they pulled the maritime piece out of PD 27
Okay.
and created the motor plan, which is the Maritime Operational Threat Response, which is just PD 27, but only for maritime jobs.
Got it.
And there are certain triggers that like force the motor plan's activation, and that we deal with all of the maritime stuff. So kind of some of the stuff that we do a lot with the motor plan are like counter narcotics missions and drug issues. Those are like the bread and butter of the motor plan. But there are other triggers that we've had to deal, especially with COVID, because if we're trying to board, let's take a generic drug case. So Coast Guard has the authority and the jurisdiction to enforce U.S. laws. We have that inherent into our organization. However, under international law, a foreign flag vessel, we don't have the authority to exert jurisdiction over that.
It's been more or less that's territory of the country that it's flagged.
So we have, international agreements, bilateral agreements between the United States and a lot of these countries on how we can do shipwrighter and get on board some of these boats. But we still need to let state know, because there's only one department in the entire organization, the entire U.S. government, that's authorized and empowered to do foreign affairs, and that's the State Department. And so if we go on board a boat, a drug boat, that is flagged Costa Rican, for instance, and Costa Rica affirms that flag, we need to let the State Department know that we've done something.
Got it.
And if there are instances where we don't have an agreement, and there are countries in the world that we do not have bilateral maritime agreements with,
and this is part of the cat and mouse game of drug smuggling. So boats know that and will raise that flag and know that buys them time.
Yeah, and we have ways around that. There are international law stuff, but Costa Rica, where we have an agreement, it's pretty easy, pretty seamless. But let's say we have an African country, which we had, a couple years ago. Um, the what was it? Cameroon. Yeah, it was Cameroon. And we don't have an agreement with them, so we have to wait to get permission of Cameroon to board this vessel.
And so I remember this from maritime law. So we call this a SNO, or a statement of no objection.
So a statement of no objection is just Coast Guard.
Just Coast Guard.
It's just Coast Guard policy. Like the interagency, like you say SNO around like people from state.
Nobody else knows about
Nobody else knows about it.
Okay.
It's just an internal Coast Guard policy.
Got it.
Let's say we need to leverage our embassy in Cameroon to get the government to respond. Well, we have to go through state and call up state and say, hey, we need you guys to get on the phone and ask the post to weigh in on this.
And that was your office?
That was my office.
Okay. So, yeah. So maybe it might be helpful. So let's say, let's explain from a legal perspective, or even just from a backroom type perspective. What happens? So Coast Guard cutter is out on the high seas.
Yep.
Sees a drug boat.
Yep.
What happens, from that point where they see that boat and they're potentially able to board it? What is happening on in your office? How is that information being transmitted to then get the legal permission to board that boat?
So the actual Coast Guard cutters, they're coming up on, they'll approach the vessel and ask like a bunch of different questions, like how many people are on board, what's their flag, what's their last port of call, what's their next port of call. Basic questions under a legal construct called right of approach questioning, where we can query any ship to verify flag kind of stuff. And they're kind of, Coast Guard cutters are developing reasonable suspicion to see if we want to get on board this boat because we think they're doing something illegal or not. If we think they're doing something illegal, they'll pass it up to the upper echelons, and then the upper echelons will either agree or disagree with the criterion, whether it meets the requirements to conduct a boarding.
That's at the sort of...
That's either in Miami or in Alameda, depending on which side of the world you're on.
Got it. So sort of like land area, PAC area.
District 7, District 11.
District 7, District 11. Got it.
Because the districts have been empowered to do kind of some of this stuff.
Okay.
And if we have a bilateral agreement with these countries, we'll go through the various processes, and each country has a different process of how we go about.
So from the district, then they're contacting your office.
Yes, it goes to MLE, the programmatic office.
Okay.
So the Office of Maritime Law Enforcement. If they don't have the authority already delegated down to them via bilateral agreement or what have you, which most of the time they do, but if there is some sort of weird request that falls outside of the norm, then they'll approach headquarters in Washington. Headquarters in Washington would come into my office and be like, hey, we want to get everybody around the phone and talk about it.
Got it.
And we would gladly talk about it and, figure out what the resolution is going to be and who needs to contact who, and make sure that everybody is on the same page, because generally speaking, the desired national outcome is the successful prosecution of narcotics traffickers. That's generally speaking the desired national outcome.
I guess desired international outcome, I would say.
Yes. And so that the government will work to get that done. And sometimes, because justice has a piece of this, because they're the ones actually doing the prosecution. So DOJ has a piece, state has a piece, because we're dealing with foreign nationals and foreign relations. DHS obviously has a piece between, the fact that we have a Coast Guard cutter, but we also have to bring them into the country. So that's a, Customs and Border Protection issue of how we're bringing them into the country and then turning the custody over. So there's a lot of overlapping seams that have to be worked out. And generally speaking, it works out pretty well. Sometimes Sometimes there are hiccups. Sometimes there's, trip wires.
And that's what your office is there
That's
for.
what my office was there for. And it was awesome. In much like the Coast Guard, there's a lot of desire in the international community because not very few countries have interagencies processes that work specifically in the maritime world like us. And so there's a lot of exporting of this concept, this idea, not necessarily the exact framework of the motor plan, because the motor plan is very detailed to the U.S. government and the way we've structured our executive branch. But the idea of, all right, so you have this instance, let's say counter narcotics or cyber or what have you, human trafficking, contagion, what have you. Who do you need around this table to get the right authorities and capabilities to confront the problem? And that's what my office would do. We definitely were not a call center. We actually did stuff, but we held a Rolodex of, we knew through personal relationships and just time who we needed to call for various things. So like with COVID, for instance, at the very onset, when we were trying to figure out how to offload hundreds of thousands of, cruise ship passengers, or, there was a container ship with, people that had influenza-like illnesses. ILI was like the big catchword in Washington for the longest time. You're like, oh God, there's 3 crew members with ILI. We would call we'd call CDC and be like, who at the quarantine station do we need to have on to make sure that all of the concerns at the local port level are met, but also because that was so managed in Washington at that time, making sure that all of the stakeholders in Washington knew what was going on. And so it was a pretty interesting time. It was a very fluid time. I think we're still in the pandemic, and the after action report has yet to be written, but there are going to be things that come out of that after action report that will definitely change the way we do policy inside the Beltway. But it was cool to see kind of part of that and be in like a real life situation of that. And once again, I've had a very atraditional career, but it's been pretty cool to see various aspects of how decisions are made, and how decisions are reached, in that process. So it was cool to see at the National Security Council level, like how that organization operated, and how, you can have the same problem in 2 different departments. So, for instance, migration issues, how the State Department and the Department of Homeland Security view the same problem in very different lenses. Both are equally valid, but they just view the problem inherently differently. And sometimes those viewpoints are competing, and sometimes they're complementary. But it was a fascinating kind of viewpoint into the U.S. government operations.
Very cool. Very cool. Ryan, thanks a ton for coming out.
Yeah, no, this is fun.
Thank you for talking to us about all this. And we'll hope to hear from you soon.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us in the Trident Room. For more information about today's guest and topics, please visit the show notes. The Trident Room Podcast has been brought to you by the Naval Postgraduate School, Alumni Association, and Foundation. For questions, comments, and suggestions, please email us at tridentroompodcasthost@nps.edu and find us online at nps.edu/Trident Room Podcast.